This is The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Juliet Spare. In this discussion, I'm going to be asking if Britain cares enough about mental health. Around 10 million people in the UK are affected by it at one time. That's 1 in 6. And it's estimated to cost the UK economy over £77 billion a year in care costs, economic losses and premature deaths. Around £2 billion alone is lost due to people taking time off work for depression and anxiety disorders. I'm joined by Dr. Alex Langford, a psychiatrist from the South London and Maudsley NHS Trust, Erica Camus, a freelance journalist and activist who bravely writes about her own battle with mental health, Rachel Waddingham, manager of the London Hearing Voices Project, and Dr. Claire Henderson, senior lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College London. I'm going to turn to you first, Dr. Langford, Alex. I'd like to quote your recent article in that you said, "I make no apologies for directly comparing standards of care in physical and mental health. If this was physical health, there would be an outrage."
This is an issue that we see time and time again. Mental illness and physical illness, they're not exactly the same thing, but they deserve just the same amount of respect from people. They deserve just as much care, and they deserve just the same amount of funding. I think seeing the state of our mental health system, with people being ferried all over the country to just find a bed to lie in for the night to keep them safe, shows just how much this government values mental illness, and I think that reflects on how we as a society see mental illness. So when people sometimes suffer from mental illness, they really struggle to speak out because they see that this is how it gets treated.
Can you give us a picture of the current situation as you see it, based in South London at the Maudsley?
Well, over the whole country, we've lost over the last 2 years probably about 9% of the total number of psychiatric beds. So that's just over 1,700 beds over the whole country. If that happened to physical health, it would be on the front of every newspaper. It wouldn't be off the news. When Jeremy Hunt tried to close Lewisham A&E, there were protests, there were marches in the street, petitions, but we've lost 10% of our beds, and nobody really seems to have noticed. And you hear stories all the time of patients going into A&E just deeply, deeply in crisis, suffering horribly with mental health problems, and being told that the hospitals are full, and if they really want a bed, then they'll have to be sent 200, 300 miles away, London to Manchester, London to Somerset. Sometimes, sadly, there's no bed at all and they have to sleep on a sofa, which I find absolutely abhorrent. Sometimes they get sent home. It's not hard to grasp just how bad this is for people's mental health. There have been documented cases where this has caused serious harm to people. There was one case I mentioned in my own article of a young lady who sadly was in such a crisis and a bed couldn't be found for her that she took her own life a day later. I'm sure that's not the only case that happens. It's just not possible that that's the only case of that happening. This issue is just so widespread. It's absolutely shocking.
I'm really interested to hear from you, Erica Camus. Alex says if this was a physical health condition and the lack of beds, people would be in uproar. This would be in the news every day. As a journalist and someone who's written about mental health, why don't we care about it?
Well, I can relate to a lot of what Alex is saying, in particular the beds, because I've had a problem with that myself. I was in Birmingham in April 2010 and I was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, and I ended up in accident and emergency in Birmingham. But they didn't have any space for me in a local hospital, and as my GP notes were in Southampton, I had to get driven down to Southampton, where I stayed in hospital for a week. And of course, because there was that problem and I had to go all the way to Southampton, I didn't get any visitors. So I can see how someone perhaps with a more severe paranoid schizophrenia might find that very traumatic. And of course, I didn't want to stay there and get the help I really needed. So I was out of there in a week, just because it was quite uncomfortable. So I can relate to the beds issue, definitely, from first-hand experience. And I also think that there's a big problem with getting services. I've heard so many times people saying, "Oh, it looks like you've slipped through the net," or there doesn't seem to be any talking therapies available. I was diagnosed first in 2003, and it isn't until recently, until I'm in remission, that I've been able to access talking therapies on the NHS, which I think it just goes to show what a bad state the services are in. So I can completely empathise and agree with what Alex is saying.
As someone who's had to go through the system or slip through the net, can you explain, Dr. Claire Henderson, what are talking therapies?
Psychological treatments, and there was quite a variety of them, and they are available, although often after quite a long wait, both through primary care for people, for example, with depression, and also through specialist mental health services. So a bigger variety of types of psychological therapies, and also for bigger varieties of illnesses, including the kinds of problems that people with paranoid schizophrenia have. So, for example, hearing voices or delusional thinking.
Which leads us rather nicely on to you, Rachel Waddingham. You work to raise awareness of voice hearing through your campaign. Tell us a little bit about that. And is this something you've experienced yourself?
Yes, like Erica, I was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but back in 1998, so quite a long time ago. And as part of that, I was struggling with voices, visions, really unusual beliefs that there was aliens after me, and spent quite a few years in hospital. So I'm no stranger to what Alex says about the kind of issue with beds. And more importantly, I think the issue with accessing treatment, excuse me, bit of a cold at the moment. So the sort of mainstream treatment is medication, which kind of puts a big blanket over the voices and kind of can quieten them down and can be quite useful. But the downside is it doesn't necessarily help you find ways of dealing with it or understanding why you might be having those experiences. So kind of within the Hearing Voices network, which I'm part of, and the London Hearing Voices project at Mind in Camden, our work's around creating safe spaces for people that have voices, visions or other unusual experiences to come together, share their experiences and kind of engage in mutual support and create communities that enable people to kind of just not feel like a freak and to be able to speak openly and find ways of coping. So we've got projects for young people. So I started having visions when I was about sort of 7 or 8, but couldn't tell anybody about it because it's very sort of frightening and obviously very stigmatised. And so we work with children and young people and with child and adolescent mental health services to help them start opening up and start kind of getting the support that they need. We also work in prisons and with people who are in the community. I think the big part is the idea that lots of people have these experiences, but most of us aren't talking to each other. So it's just very isolating. So we're just trying to lift the lid on that and say that hearing voices and this thing doesn't have to be a major issue as long as you get the right support. And even Gandhi heard voices. So, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that causes the years of mental health use the mental health service use that I've had.
I guess it'd be quite sensible to come to you next then, Claire Henderson, because you work with an organisation called Time to Change, which is to get rid of the stigma attached to all mental health aspects.
That's right.
Tell us a bit about that.
So, Time to Change is run by the two big mental health charities in England, Mind and Rethink Mental Illness. And we at the Institute of Psychiatry have led on the evaluation since the start of it back in 2008. It was initially funded by Big Lottery Fund and Comic Relief, and it's now funded, continues to have funding from Comic Relief, but also is mainly funded now from the Department of Health. And our evaluation does make me feel somewhat hopeful, I have to say, that something like a big and sustained anti-stigma programme, particularly with sort of the credibility that governments support and also support from a charity with good profile like Comic Relief has, can really make a difference, because we have seen somewhat of a shift in public attitudes in terms of what people say about whether they would be willing, for example, to live with somebody with a mental health problem in the future. Also, more people are aware of the fact that they know somebody with a mental health problem, at least in terms of what they say to the person who's interviewing for these general population surveys. So either more people are willing to say to an interviewer that they know someone, which reflects, a reduction in stigma, or someone has disclosed to them, which they hadn't done before, so they've realised that they know someone. And both of those things, are positive. The other thing that we've found over the first 4 years of Time to Change is that people's experiences of discriminations had lessened somewhat. We do an annual survey of people using mental health services, and they, after 4 years, reported less discrimination in their sort of social life and with family and friends. And it seems that, interpersonally, the kind of contact that people are having is improving a little bit. There's still an awfully long way to go, but I do think there is a bit of a shift there. And in a way, it's up to organisations like the provision of mental health services to kind of catch up with that improvement in the way that people what people are experiencing in terms of their social life.
Do you think then, Alex Langford, then that if the situation with the beds and the cuts was addressed, and that if there was a response to the lack of beds and the cuts like there are to, say, maternity wards, or the fact, like the example you gave with Lewisham Hospital, that if we started there, then mental health would be pushed higher up the agenda, and then we would get to the point, and that would sort of be coupled with what Claire said there, which is the shift in stigma.
I think it all works together. It all interacts. If we funded mental health services properly, people would get better care, and this would be in the limelight better, so people would be able to understand better what these problems are really about. I think it's fantastic that you've got Rachel and Erica in the studio today who demonstrate so amazingly that you can have a really serious mental illness, and it's not a slight on your character. It's not going to consume your whole personality. You can live your life. You're very, very much an individual. You can achieve things. It's fantastic to see that. And I've got to say that Claire's also right. I mean, over the years, stigma has lessened. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, it would be an indelible mark on your character to have an illness like this. You'd struggle to get a job. And now that's not so bad at all. But we've still got a lot of work to do. And as you suggest, I think if we started funding these issues seriously, it would really send a message to how important these problems are. They're not second fiddle to physical health problems. They really aren't. They're, if anything, more important, I think.
I'd like to come back then to Erica there, who admitted having mental health issues at work. How is this received by your employers?
Well, there have been experiences I've had where I've decided not to disclose because of the stigma, and then as part of my activism I often give my story to newspapers. Well, I was working as a lecturer at a time at a university, and some students saw one of the articles I wrote online, and they started something on Facebook saying, look, our lecturer's a psycho. That the dean of the faculty found out, and I was fired on the spot for gross misconduct for not declaring that I'd had a mental illness. But they say that if I had declared it, I would have got the job and they would have put the correct support in place, but I don't believe them. I don't think I would have got the job if I had declared it. On the other hand, as part of my activism, I'm a media volunteer for Time to Change and Rethink Mental Illness. And I've also done, while I was out of work and signed off sick, I did some work experience at the media office at Rethink Mental Illness. And I found disclosure there was just easy because the person you're disclosing to at the initial stages is going to be very understanding. And it might even be seen as a strength that you've overcome something rather than a slight on your character. And it wasn't really discussed, there were no problems while I worked there. It was just nice to feel safe in that environment and that there wouldn't be any problems from not disclosing, or that I'd need to keep it hidden. And it if people were more understanding and you felt you could disclose, it would be much easier.
In what way do you feel that there's still a barrier then for being able to disclose previous health issues, or being able to disclose a health issue that might have future implications?
Well, it's very difficult to prove something like disability discrimination. I did find that after I'd written about my experiences under my real name, I was out of work, and I did find it very difficult to get back into work. And it wasn't until I started to change my name of the articles online and create a nom-de-plume, that I started to get work again.
That sums it up, I guess, in a way, that the stigma is still there, and you were sacked for gross misconduct for writing an article about your personal health issues online. And I guess, I mean, Rachel, what experience have you had with the stigma that's been attached to hearing voices?
I think voice hearing is one of the most stigmatising experiences. I know yesterday I was running a workshop with mental health professionals about supporting young people who hear voices that are quite violent, so ones that talk about you hurting other people. And I've certainly had those kind of voices too. And I think they're like a taboo within a taboo, that even more stigmatised than hearing a voice telling you to have a cup of tea. And I guess one of the issues here is we can be so afraid of it because it's a command hallucination. We've kind of given it to the psychiatrists and the mental health professionals as a society because we can't deal with it and we're afraid of it. And then there's a lot of language that's to do with that makes it sound very frightening and uncontrollable. And then society kind of doesn't want to deal with it because there's someone else that can. So if you've got schizophrenia diagnosis, then see a psychiatrist, don't get a job. If you've got this, then talk to your nurse, don't talk to your housing worker. It's almost we've sectioned off a big group of people that are struggling with an issue because we're afraid of it. But actually, my experience of stigma is when I felt unable to talk about it, I'd get a lot of bad reactions, like people going, "Oh, but you're not violent, are you?" Or "Where's your axe?" and that kind of stuff. Don't actually have the axe with me. I keep it at home until weekends. But what kind of changed is when I was able to kind of open up and sort of confront that and talk with taxi drivers and random people about what I do and who I am and have normal conversations, then the stigma just kind of goes down. And that's been really, really good. So people that were very afraid of, like me marrying my husband who's not got a mental health issue, and they were like, "Oh my God, he's going to become your carer," talk to his friends, and then suddenly they actually understand that, okay, so I hear voices. I no longer see myself as having a mental illness because it doesn't affect me. It's just part of who I am, and that's okay.
Do you think enough people who suffer with mental health problems, have that confidence to feel that? Or is there a huge proportion of patients out there who really need that help and guidance?
The more, in my experience, the more difficult your mental health problem, obviously the less likely you are to be able to speak up about it. And maybe what's happened over the years is some illnesses which are maybe a little bit easier to recover from, the depressions, the OCDs, things that you can still talk about with other people, they've softened in our views to them. We're much more comfortable talking about depression and OCD now, and things like bipolar disorder. People with really, really loud celebrities like Stephen Fry who can talk about that. We're more comfortable with that now. But it's things like schizophrenia that we're scared of it because we don't know about it, and we don't see people with it as they really are. And I think it's fantastic to hear Rachel talking about this, and Johnny Benjamin, who's made programs for the BBC and is all over YouTube. He's an absolutely fantastic young man, and he happens to have schizoaffective disorder, and people can see that it's not something which turns you into an awful axe-wielding maniac. What really frustrates me is the way that the media and big corporations still seem to see it like that. We've had the Sun headline recently, 12,000 killed by mental patients. We've got Thorpe Park currently with an asylum ride, which they just don't seem to understand is just highly offensive to almost everybody involved in mental health. It's this kind of casual stigma that we just need to completely eradicate. It's just such a commonplace. We're used to thinking of the psychiatric patient with the axe covered in blood in the films, but that is not acceptable, and it needs to stop, and I'm really happy to see it gradually being squeezed out of society.
It's that casual stigma that I suspect is the hardest one to sort of get rid of, is it not, Claire?
Yes, up to actually, I think I'm going to disagree with that, because I think it's something that people can learn, in the same way that people have had to change their attitudes about, how people talk about people of other ethnicities or gender or people with other disabilities. I think it's the more institutional level discrimination, for example, on the part of employers, which may be harder to shift. And I think, in terms of mental health services, we're not great. We still do very institutional kind of things to people, and when we provide poor care, we discriminate in that way. So it's not just about whether funding has gone up or down. It's it's the way that we treat people as well. And obviously, if we're feeling demoralised as mental health professionals because of lack of funding, then it obviously makes it harder. But there are aspects of our care, that we could improve no matter what level of funding we have or don't have. And that's, I think, where self-help groups and peer support, people with mental health problems helping each other really comes in. This is something I think that really, from what I've seen, living in the States for 5 years, really kind of arose in the States more than anywhere else, partly because there are such huge gaps in care there. There's some parts of the US where there's really nothing, for miles going on. So self-help sprouts, where there is a kind of a vacuum, and fills those kind of gaps. And that's what's going to empower people to the extent that, you can have campaigns about the horrible things like the asylum maze in Thorpe Park. The internet obviously is incredibly helpful in, helping people reach out to each other and campaign in that way.
Alex, I just wanted to ask you a question. Do you think that the shift then towards a more community approach to dealing with mental health problems has taken away the onus of the fact that there aren't enough beds?
I think we need to keep people out of hospital as much as possible. I mean, I prefer people to be at home with their family, with their friends, getting better there. But I think that there's always going to be a small proportion of people who just will need to come into hospital, and we need to make sure they're provided for. And in my opinion, what we often see from politicians is distracting us from cuts in one area by talking up another area. We need great early intervention services, and we need great community mental health teams. But we also need an adequate amount of beds for those rare circumstances when they are needed. I'm all for keeping people out of hospital and off medication and into talking therapy. I think you get the service you pay for, and it's just not happening.
Erica, you say you're an activist, and the articles you've written online in a very brave way to talk about the issue. Why is it still such a taboo subject? Why is it such an unpopular topic?
Well, I agree it is, and I think there is so much stigma still attached to it that unfortunately people are afraid to talk about their experiences, and because they're afraid to talk about their experiences, they're not getting the care that they need. There is next month on the 11th of November, it's Schizophrenia Awareness Week. And, charities are out there working to help people talk about it more and make it more acceptable. I'm not really sure why it's so taboo, but it is. That's kind of the way it is at the moment. It's where the land lies.
Rachel?
I think it's really interesting to even ask the question, why doesn't society care about mental health when everyone has mental health? And I think that's almost the crux of it, that one of the reasons I think people are afraid is because they recognise they've got stuff in themselves that they're struggling with. Say my husband, he's a regular guy, never been diagnosed with anything, but he will say that I'm much saner than he is, which is probably true, to be honest. So maybe it's that people are kind of afraid of losing control, afraid of other people losing control, and we kind of tightly hold on to it, put people in diagnostic boxes to make it all feel very safe. And what would happen if we remove those diagnostic boxes and started talking about experiences? So instead of saying schizophrenia, what if I said, well, I've been through some really terrible things in my life, I hear voices, I get really confused sometimes, and I feel really worried that people are going to hurt me. And I talked about it like that. Maybe we could have a better conversation. So I think if we could just open it up so we can just talk about what we mean by these experiences rather than get stuck on whether someone has a mental health problem diagnosed or not, maybe we'd create a more helpful society.
If more people were prepared to do that, then people would not necessarily relate, but they might engage with it a bit more, and that would obviously perhaps have a knock-on effect to the stigma.
just that's very much what the Hearing Voices movement's about. So me and Erica, we're not that unusual. We're awesome, but we're not that unusual. I know loads of people, like Eleanor Longdon gave a talk at TED, which is an international conference about her experiences. It's been viewed almost 1 million times. So there's increasingly more people that are coming and speaking out. I think it's just that you do need these safe spaces like self-help groups and kind of supportive relationships with your family or professionals or your friends that give you that courage, because it's, as Erica's already demonstrated, it can be quite risky to speak out in a society that's still quite stigmatised.
I agree, and I think it is happening. I think it's increasing, and I think this is one of the good things about a campaign like Time to Change, because what's been interesting about the way that Time to Change has developed over the years is when they started, there wasn't very much social media. So a lot of the plans about the social marketing campaign was about doing TV adverts, things on buses, the traditional kinds of not terribly interactive, campaigning. But then they realised that they had this big following on Facebook. And now, they can be in much more communication with individuals, through things like Twitter. So that, for example, when the mental patient costumes went on sale through Asda and Amazon and Tesco, that the reaction to that started from individual people taking pictures themselves and saying, look, this is what a mental patient looks like. Here I am, regular person. And then Time to Change can pick up on that because obviously they have very good access to mainstream media. Then the head of Time to Change, Sue Baker, gets on TV, and so Time to Change can help to empower people, picks up on what they're saying about things, and also gives them a platform, if you like. For example, Erica, you were saying you act as a media volunteer for Time to Change.
And Erica, I guess you'd agree that social media like Twitter is a useful platform for your voice, or for all voices, and really, really helps that continue that dialogue that is perhaps not so popular within the mainstream. It gives an outlet for anyone who wants to talk about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a flip side. There's been discrimination because of the articles online, but there's also been a very positive response from people who have been in my situation. And you get emails and you get tweets and you get letters, and there's a real sense of community on Twitter and online between service users, and there's a real sense of solidarity. And I think that's a really positive thing. And I think as long as we can be seen interacted in this nice way, it can only be a good thing.
I'm going to end slightly there on a positive note. But a final word from you, Alex, since I started with you.
As you've been discussing, I think social media is just so important these days. My article wouldn't have been out there if it wasn't for Twitter. I know other recent articles and other recent investigations wouldn't have been done without just Twitter. The mental health patient costumes is Twitter again. It's giving a voice to people who've never had a voice before and who need to be heard. And I would just want to see more of that, I think.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but I'd like to thank my guests, Dr. Alex Langford, psychiatrist from the South London and Maudsley NHS Trust, Erica Camus, freelance journalist who bravely writes about her own battle with mental health, Rachel Waddingham, manager of the London Hearing Voices Project, and Dr. Claire Henderson, senior lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College, London. Erica Camus, a freelance journalist and activist who bravely writes about her own battle with mental health, Rachel Waddingham, manager of the London Hearing Voices Project, and Dr. Claire Henderson, senior lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College, London. I'm going to turn to you first, Dr. Langford, Alex. I'd like to quote your recent article in that you said, "I make no apologies for directly comparing standards of care in physical and mental health. If this was physical health, there would be an outrage."
This is an issue that we see time and time again. Mental illness and physical illness, they're not exactly the same thing, but they deserve just the same amount of respect from people. They deserve just as much care, and they deserve just the same amount of funding. I think seeing the state of our mental health system, with people being ferried all over the country to just find a bed to lie in for the night to keep them safe, shows just how much this government values mental illness, and I think that reflects on how we as a society see mental illness. So when people sometimes suffer from mental illness, they really struggle to speak out because they see that this is how it gets treated.
Can you give us a picture of the current situation as you see it, based in South London at the Maudsley?
Well, over the whole country, we've lost over the last 2 years probably about 9% of the total number of psychiatric beds. So that's just over 1,700 beds over the whole country. If that happened to physical health, it would be on the front of every newspaper. It wouldn't be off the news. There have been documented cases where this has caused serious harm to people. There was one case I mentioned in my own article of a young lady who sadly was in such a crisis and a bed couldn't be found for her that she took her own life a day later. I'm sure that's not the only case that happens. It's just not possible that that's the only case of that happening. This issue is just so widespread. It's absolutely shocking.
I'm really interested to hear from you, Erica Camus. Alex says if this was a physical health condition and the lack of beds, people would be in uproar. This would be in the news every day. As a journalist and someone who's written about mental health, why don't we care about it?
Well, I can relate to a lot of what Alex is saying, in particular the beds.
When Jeremy Hunt tried to close Lewisham A&E, there were protests, there were marches in the street, petitions, but we've lost 10% of our beds and nobody really seems to have noticed. And you hear stories all the time of patients going into A&E just deeply, deeply in crisis, suffering horribly with mental health problems. And being told that the hospitals are full, and if they really want a bed, then they'll have to be sent 200, 300 miles away, London to Manchester, London to Somerset. Sometimes, sadly, there's no bed at all, and they have to sleep on a sofa, which I find absolutely abhorrent. Sometimes they get sent home. It's not hard to grasp just how bad this is for people's mental health.
This is The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Juliet Spare. In this discussion, I'm going to be asking if Britain cares enough about mental health. Around 10 million people in the UK are affected by it at one time. That's 1 in 6. And it's estimated to cost the UK economy over £77 billion a year in care costs, economic losses and premature deaths. Around 2 billion alone is lost due to people taking time off work for depression and anxiety disorders. I'm joined by Dr. Alex Langford, a psychiatrist from the South London and Maudsley NHS Trust,